clock struck 12. Max's eyes opened, every night the same. He sat up in bed, heart thumping. Something felt wrong. He could feel it in the air, a cold shiver that ran down his spine. The room was dark except for the faint moonlight casting shadows on the wall. Max's gaze drifted to the corner. An old antique mirror stood there, its ornate frame shimmering faintly. He hated that mirror. His grandmother had left it to him, and he hadn't been able to get rid of it. Every time he looked at it, he felt a chill, a sense of unease that he couldn't shake. The mirror was tall and narrow, its silver backing tarnished with age. The glass itself seemed to breathe, fogging slightly with each exhale from Max's nervous breaths. He pulled the covers up to his chin, trying to ignore it, but he couldn't help but feel like he was being watched, his every move scrutinized by something cold and unseen. Max tried to focus on something else, anything else. He counted the seconds, the minutes, willing the fear to subside. But the feeling persisted, a knot of dread twisting in his stomach. He knew he wouldn't be able to relax until he looked at the mirror, to face whatever it was that haunted its reflection. He couldn't help himself. Slowly, Max turned his head, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced at the mirror, a quick, furtive peek. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just his own reflection, pale and wide-eyed in the dim light. But then, he noticed something in the background, a figure, barely discernible, lurking in the shadows of the room. Max's breath hitched in his throat. He blinked, unsure if what he was seeing was real or a figment of his overactive imagination. The figure remained, a dark silhouette against the pale moonlight. It was taller than a man, its edges blurring and shifting like smoke. Terror gripped Max's heart, squeezing it tight. The next night, the same thing happened. Midnight, the mirror, the figure. But this time, it was closer. Max watched in horror as the shadowy form seemed to glide closer to the surface of the mirror, its edges becoming more defined, its presence more menacing. He could have sworn he saw a pair of glowing eyes fixated on him, burning into his soul. Fear rooted Max to the spot. He wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stare into that horrifying reflection, but he was paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. The figure in the mirror seemed to feed off his fear, growing larger, more substantial with each passing moment. Night after night, the terrifying scene repeated itself. Max would lie in bed, the darkness of his room pressing in on him, the silence almost deafening. He could feel the weight of the night, the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to grow thicker with each passing moment. The figure in the mirror continued its slow, relentless advance. It was a shadowy silhouette, barely discernible, yet its presence was undeniable. Each night it seemed to come closer, its movements deliberate and menacing. It was almost as if it was trying to break free from its glassy prison, to reach out and grab Max, to drag him into the mirror's cold embrace. The hands, pale and ghostly, would press against the glass, leaving smudges that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. He tried to avoid looking at the mirror, but it was no use. The more he tried to resist, the stronger the compulsion became. It was as if the mirror had a will of its own, a dark, malevolent force that demanded his attention. It was like a magnet, drawing his gaze, holding him captive. His eyes would lock onto the reflection, unable to look away, his heart pounding in his chest as the figure in the mirror seemed to mock his fear. Max's sleep was plagued by nightmares, vivid and horrifying. He would wake up in a cold sweat, the images from his dreams lingering in his mind, refusing to fade. The figure in the mirror haunted his every thought, a constant presence even in his subconscious, his waking hours consumed by fear. The daylight offered no respite, the terror followed him, a shadow that clung to him wherever he went. He would jump at the slightest sound, his nerves frayed and his mind on edge. He was a prisoner in his own home, too terrified to even leave his room. The walls that once provided comfort now felt like a cage, trapping him with his fear and the ever-present mirror. The mirror had become his tormentor, a silent sentinel that watched his every move. Its surface seemed to ripple with malevolence, the figure within it a constant reminder of his helplessness, the figure within it his constant dread. It was a specter that refused to be ignored, its presence growing stronger with each passing night. Max could feel its eyes on him, cold and unfeeling, as if it was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He knew he had to do something, but what? The fear was paralyzing, but he couldn't let it control him forever. He had to find a way to break free from the mirror's grip, to reclaim his life from the shadow that had taken hold of it. How could he escape something trapped within a reflection? The answer eluded him, but he knew he had to try. The mirror's power was growing, and if he didn't act soon, he feared it would consume him entirely. The battle for his soul had begun, and Max was determined to win. One night, driven to desperation, Max decided to get rid of the mirror once and for all. He couldn't live like this anymore, haunted by the terrifying figure in the glass. He grabbed a heavy blanket, threw it over the mirror, and with a surge of adrenaline, ripped it from the wall. The mirror crashed to the floor, the sound deafening in the quiet night. Max stood there, panting, staring at the fallen mirror. It lay on the ground, the blanket partially obscuring its surface. He could still feel the cold emanating from it, a physical presence that sent shivers down his spine. He grabbed his baseball bat, his hands trembling, and approached the fallen mirror with caution. With a deep breath, Max reared back the bat. His hands trembled slightly, the weight of the bat feeling heavier than ever. He could feel the tension in his muscles, the anticipation building up inside him. This was it, the moment he had been dreading and longing for. He had to do it. There was no turning back now, and swung it with all his might. The wood connected with the glass, sending a shockwave up his arms. The mirror didn't just break, it exploded into 1,000 pieces, each shard catching the dim light and scattering it across the room. The sound was explosive, echoing through the room like a gunshot. For a moment, Max felt a surge of relief. The mirror was gone, destroyed. Maybe now, finally, the nightmare would end. He stood there for a long moment, catching his breath, his chest heaving with the effort. The adrenaline was still coursing through his veins, making his hands shake. His heart still pounding in his chest, he tried to calm himself. The silence that followed was almost deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just erupted. He looked around the room, his eyes darting to every shadow, every corner, half expecting the figure to materialize from the broken shards. But there was nothing. Just the shattered remains of the mirror, glinting ominously on the floor. The room felt emptier now, as if the destruction of the mirror had sucked the life out of it. He took a cautious step forward, the crunch of glass under his feet, the only sound breaking the silence. The lingering sense of unease clung to him like a shroud, refusing to dissipate. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him, waiting. The room, once a place of torment, now felt like a tomb. Max knew that breaking the mirror was just the beginning. The real battle was far from over. He had to stay vigilant, for the shadows still lurked and the nightmare was not yet fully vanquished. But the relief was short-lived. As Max turned away from the shattered mirror, his blood ran cold. A shiver ran down his spine and his breath caught in his throat. He slowly turned back towards the spot where the mirror had stood, his eyes widening in terror. The figure was still there. It was no longer a reflection trapped behind a pane of glass. It stood in the space where the mirror had been, its form solid, its presence undeniable. The shadowy figure was now a living, breathing nightmare, and it was staring directly at Max. Max was frozen in place, his mind reeling. He had destroyed the mirror, but the figure remained. It was free. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had not escaped the nightmare. He had only made it real. The figure took a step towards him, its movements fluid and silent, like a predator stalking its prey. Max stumbled back, his heart pounding against his ribs like a drum. He had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The figure advanced, its presence filling the room, suffocating him with terror. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for the inevitable. A cold hand touched his face. Max opened his eyes, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the window. He could feel the icy fingers lingering on his skin, sending shivers down his spine. He tried to move, but his body felt paralyzed, as if held down by an unseen force. The figure stood directly in front of him, its face inches from his own. Max's breath caught in his throat as he stared into the eyes of the apparition. They were dark, hollow, and seemed to pierce through his very soul. The figure's presence was overwhelming, a suffocating weight that pressed down on him. It was then that Max realized the truth. This was no ordinary nightmare. The figure before him was not just a figment of his imagination. It was real, and it was here for him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. How could this be happening? What did it want from him? The figure in the mirror, the creature that had haunted his nights, was him. Max's reflection, twisted and distorted, stared back at him with a malevolent grin. He had seen this face before in his dreams, in the shadows of his room, but now it was no longer confined to the glass. It had crossed over into his reality. His reflection, no longer confined to the glass, was now staring back at him with a chilling familiarity. The lines between reality and nightmare blurred, and Max felt a deep sense of dread. He could see every detail of the figure's face, every line and shadow that mirrored his own. It was as if he was looking into a dark, twisted version of himself. The figure opened its mouth, and Max heard his own voice, distorted and grotesque, whisper into the darkness. The words were unintelligible at first, a garbled mess of sounds that sent chills down his spine, but then they became clearer, more distinct. "You cannot escape," it whispered, the voice echoing in his mind. "We are bound together forever." "We are one now," it hissed, its breath cold against his skin. Max could feel the icy tendrils of fear wrapping around his heart, squeezing tighter with each passing second. The figure's breath was like a winter chill seeping into his very bones. He wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape this nightmare, but he was frozen in place. Max screamed, a desperate primal sound that echoed into the night. It was a scream of pure terror, a sound that came from the deepest part of his soul. The room seemed to vibrate with the intensity of his fear, the walls closing in around him, but no matter how loud he screamed, there was no one to hear him, no one to save him. But it was too late. The darkness had already claimed him, pulling him deeper into its cold embrace. The figure's eyes glowed with a sinister light, and Max knew that there was no escape. He was trapped, a prisoner in his own mind, with no hope of ever breaking free. The figure was upon him, and then everything went black. Max felt a crushing weight on his chest, a suffocating pressure that made it impossible to breathe. The last thing he saw was the figure's face, twisted into a grotesque smile, before the darkness swallowed him whole. And in that moment, Max knew that he was lost, forever trapped in the nightmare that had become his reality.